Good evening. Welcome to our virtual panel. Virtual may lack the animalistic appeal of physical presence, but it is allowing tonight folks from different continents to join us. So good day and good morning to you as well, as the case may be. I'm Juan Rivero, Special Projects Director at Village Preservation. A few words of introduction. Village Preservation is a neighborhood preservation organization focused on Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. Since 1980, we have been documenting and celebrating these neighborhoods, fighting to stop inappropriate development in them while encouraging appropriate development and advocating on behalf of their cultural institutions and independent small businesses. In addition, we host about 75 free programs per year, like this one. Our events cover a wide range of topics related to the history, architecture, culture, and development of our neighborhoods. And right now we have the public art installation Village Voices on display in 24 scattered sites throughout town. You should check them out. They're pretty cool. We're a member-based organization, so your support is essential to our capacity to provide this free programming and continue our advocacy and preservation work. So if you like what we do, consider joining us or making a donation at villagepreservation.org. With that said, let's get started. To build or not to build market rate housing in order to solve the affordability crisis is the question before us. Maybe. Do we dare oppose market rate housing development and get branded as self-interested, exclusionary, classists, racists, and in a twist of the knife, old? Or do we support all of it and get branded as self-interested, naive, coddled, shiftless, and willing to sell our souls to the real estate devil in the hopes of being able to afford an apartment next to our favorite brunch spot? These, of course, are caricatures, but they are also common currency in that exemplary town meeting style deliberation that discharges from social media. And it would be tempting to dismiss this as a sandbox squabble had these terms of dispute not begun to frame and shape debates surrounding redevelopment projects in the city. It is their recurrence that has inspired us to examine more closely some of the questions raised by YIMBY, NIMBY contentions, as well as those raised by the emergence of this phenomenon in the first place. So let me start by setting forth a few questions to structure our discussion. First, what kind of a phenomenon is this? What is the best way to think about it? To provide a little bit of context, the impulse to keep something undesirable at bay has always been with us and is as human as my desire to strangle my neighbor's stereo every Friday night. But it became NIMBYism in connection with post-war suburban communities that fought to exclude from their neighborhoods uses that they regarded as detrimental to the social and economic stability of their communities. These uses include regional infrastructure projects with adverse environmental effects, as well as denser residential projects that would have allowed less affluent population, and there are racial overtones to that, access to the neighborhood. And so the NIMBY designation was coined by folks interested in the public good, like planners, to rebuke the efforts of these communities to put their parochial interests ahead of collective needs. Back then, YIMBY meant the opposite. It meant those willing to take one for the team. So now let's jump ahead to the past 10 years, during which time the NIMBY label has been applied and the YIMBY label self-applied across the country, well beyond the geographic context of their initial use, to generally designate pro and anti-development factions, both of which, incidentally, believe themselves to be fighting to advance the public good. So what do we make of this? And especially of the form that this has assumed in New York City. Pro and anti-development coalitions assuming the mantle of public good champions have been a perennial feature of the urban development landscape and are probably best understood as alignments of interest rather than as a coherent movement organized around a set of ideological principles. So is YIMBY, NIMBY anything more than that? The same old pro and anti-development camps with a catchy label attached to them? And if not, what are they? Second question, the differences between these factions are grounded in a series of conflicting claims. Some are normative, having to do with who belongs in a neighborhood and who gets to have a say in deciding its future. But the ones that we'll be dealing with tonight are empirical, and they have to do with the relationship between increases in new market rate housing and housing affordability. For YIMBYs, they're positively related. That is, the greater the increase in market rate housing, the greater the affordability, because an increase in even luxury housing mitigates the demand for the existing housing stock, leading housing prices to decrease across the board as available units filter down the market. So to illustrate, a new luxury quintuplex is purchased by Jeff Bezos, who then sells his other non-inhabited pad to a lesser magnate, who sells his old place to a struggling billionaire, who sells to a mere millionaire, and so forth down to you and me, and then even further down the income ladder. So in this way, more supply at a luxury level alleviates demand down market and makes housing more affordable for all. Great. There are, however, a number of factors along the way that can shape this effect and even negate it altogether. Perhaps new construction induces demand, attracting new outside buyers or investors and stopping the filtering before it even gets started. Or perhaps the filtering happens, but it does not reach down to levels that would relieve the rent burden of the lowest income households, or not enough of it does at any rate. Perhaps the filtering happens, but it takes 50 years, by which time we're all dead. Perhaps the filtering happens, but regionally, without benefiting those residing near the new construction. Or worse, perhaps a new construction introduces a higher income housing market to the neighborhood or enhances its profile, displacing existing residents either physically or culturally. Or worse yet, perhaps the mere anticipation of new construction unleashes a wave of speculation with similar displacement effects before the new construction has even happened. You can find empirical evidence to support contradictory propositions on most of these points. So what do you do with all this? Especially if your purpose is to apply these contradictory findings to New York and hold them up against folks' unsystematic but nonetheless compelling personal experiences with new construction in familiar neighborhoods. Third, and more briefly, why is development conflict taking this form? And what does its recurrence tell us about how we plan housing, about how we manage the planning process, and about how we plan our cities and our economy? And lastly, what are the uses and limitations of the YIMBY-NIMBY framing for reconciling housing needs with other dimensions of urban life, including the diverse values that we attach to our neighborhoods? And what would be more productive alternatives, bearing in mind that part of what has inspired this debate has been the perceived constraint of the politically possible. We are fortunate tonight to have someone other than me to answer in rough order these questions, or barring that, reformulate them as better questions. Our distinguished speakers in order of appearance will be Max Holleran, lecturer of social policy at the University of Melbourne and the author of this book here, Yes to the City, Millennials and the Fight for Affordable Housing, which looks untouched, not because I haven't read it, I promise, but because it just came out on Princeton University Press. Go buy it at your local bookstore. Hilary Bottin, interim associate dean and associate professor at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College. Hilary she has had a variety of career hats in housing as an academic researcher, as a policy analyst, and recently as a public member of the city's rent guidelines board. She has also struggled through a COVID infection over the past 2 days to be with us tonight. So I want to extend her an extra special thank you on behalf of everyone. And last but not least, Bob Lake, professor emeritus in the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, and a member of the graduate faculties in Geography and Urban Planning at Rutgers University. Bob is the author or editor of 7 books and over 100 articles, chapters, and commentaries on a range of urban public policy issues, including notably the NIMBY movement. Each of them will speak. Then I may ask a couple of questions, depending on how we're doing with time. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. We're hoping to have 30 minutes at least for that. Please use the Q&A function for submitting questions at any point. No need to wait till the end. If we have time, we'll promote you to speakers so that you may pose the question yourself. If we don't, I'll relay the question for you, but do write it down. Now, there are many people, and there's little time, which is life in a nutshell. If we don't get to some, we may still address the question subsequently in some fashion. And feel free to suggest ideas for future programs on this or related topics. And with that, I hand it over to Hillary. No, sorry, to Max. I handed it over to Max. Yeah, I'm not even listening to myself. To Max.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that really concise introduction. There's a lot of things that I think are mysterious about the YIMBY movement, but one is that I think a lot of us have heard of NIMBYism, and NIMBYism is really ingrained here in the United States as a kind of cultural evil, an evil that's come from our infatuation with suburbia and the fact that so many people have their home as a primary asset, something they borrow against, something that they're very sort of cognizant of the value of. I think that YIMBYism is a little bit less known because the idea of people saying yes is something new. And I think it's something heavily marketed by this movement, which originated in San Francisco and which is about 10 years old. So in the next couple of minutes, I kind of want to give just a little bit of a history of it. And as a sociologist, talk a bit about my thoughts about why this housing movement is different from some of the housing movements we've seen in the past. So this movement comes out of San Francisco as first called SF BARF, Bay Area. So it's a joke, but it's a sort of a name that evolved into Yes in My Backyard, and then into YIMBY Action and a number of different groups. So from a sort of joke to having young professionals who wanted to see more development, it evolved into a number of different groups in different Bay Area communities and across California with a political arm. Now it is dozens of groups across the United States. And for the book that Juan mentioned, I also talked to people in Scandinavia, in the United Kingdom, and in Australia. So it's a framing that really makes sense for people. It's a thing that really gets at an issue of development, and particularly trans-oriented development, that is very resonant with a lot of people. Most of those people are young, middle class, and well-educated. They have a fair amount of previous knowledge in urban planning, and they see this group as a way to disseminate urban planning ideas to the rest of the world, whether that's attending zoning meetings, which they're very keen on. They like to go to zoning meetings. And if you believe their narrative, they will say that zoning meetings were very much populated by older people who owned property and lived in the neighborhood and who constantly said no. And their intervention was to finally say yes. It's also something that's very big online and has a giant social media presence. And part of this presence is sort of illustrating urban planning ideas, whether it's transport-oriented development, alternative transportation, densification, or the utility of building more market rate housing through memes, through Twitter, through Facebook, and really boiling down some basic ideas about urban planning. So in some ways, what a lot of YIMBYism is actually new urbanism. It's some really commonplace ideas and common sense ideas about how to densify cities and how to co-locate people's jobs, people's consumption, and people's residences. And so that is done through savvy tweets, through memes, in this new way that we haven't really seen before. On the other side, as an activist group, it really represents a step away from some of the housing movements that we saw in the past. On one hand, it's oftentimes not people who are in immediate jeopardy of losing their homes and people who live in public housing. It's people who are renters, but they're renters who are stressed, but not stressed to the breaking point. So it's a very middle-class movement in that sense. What a lot of YIMBYs have advocated for are middle-class solutions. And this advocacy is not a kind of mass movement. It's not what we see in terms of building an entire neighborhood behind them, but oftentimes it's a very professional movement. It's people who advocate to city boards, who write policy white papers, and also people who are increasingly involved in government. And that includes in the West Coast, where this is a much more popular movement than here in New York, people like the mayor of New York, or sorry, of San Francisco, London Breed, or State Senator Scott Wiener, who really have kind of ridden this out to be a major part of their policy platform. So I'll also say that, you know, in this kind of middle class movement, there's a sort of clever mixing of the morphology of the contemporary city and the kind of middle class identity of YIMBYs. So they will say most cities have a downtown business district and they have suburbs. And in between is a small area with strip malls and duplexes and apartment buildings. And these areas need to be developed. This is called the missing middle. And they use this metaphor of the missing middle, the neighborhoods that are both places where people drive, but they also take public transit, places where you can walk into the center, but also have a sort of suburban single family home ethos as the kind of metaphor for a place that could be more hospitable to a middle class that is squeezed in terms of housing affordability. So this makes a lot of sense in terms of cities that are west of the Mississippi River, where there's a lot of zoning that is specifically for single family homes. And you see a lot of these fights going on in places like Minneapolis, Denver, Austin, Texas, San Jose, California. But tonight we're going to be talking about New York. And New York is a place where densification has already happened. People are fine with living in apartments. And this kind of takes away some of the basic ideas of the YIMBY movement. I will say that the YIMBY movement is very much about educating people how to live in a dense urban life and how to like it. It's about telling people that it's okay to live in a townhouse, it's okay to live in an apartment, and those things are both environmentally something that's going to improve the quality of life of the broader community, but also something that will allow for more housing to be built, and that housing will eventually add to the stock and decrease prices overall. And that's something we'll get into, I'm sure, in the Q&A. But what I want to say is that this is a real sort of American style idea about middle classness, middle class identity of the movement, middle parts of the city. And it doesn't want to get too much into people who are permanently excluded from the housing market. It advocates for public housing as a mixture in the solution, but not the major argument of the movement. And so it sort of uses middle classness as something that makes this argument more palatable, which is also something that really resonates for Americans, because this is a country where middle class identity is cherished, and people will say, you know, I make $40,000 a year, but I'm middle class. And people will say, I make $340,000 a year, but I'm middle class. So that has been, I think, a strategic framing victory for this movement, and something they're really running with. The other thing that I think, as a sociologist, is really interesting is that they've also backed away from class altogether. In many ways, this movement is about younger people, particularly millennials, who were adversely affected by the 2008 crisis and who feel like they cannot move into neighborhoods that have good jobs and good quality of life. And that older people who already own in those neighborhoods, oftentimes of the baby boomer generation, that those people are blocking them from entering the neighborhood. So I'll say that one last thing about YIMBYism that I think has really taken off, whether it's online and sometimes in person, is a kind of intergenerational feud that replaces a lot of previous housing movements that looked at class. How much can you pay for your mortgage? How much can you pay for your rent? And I think that there's good and bad things about that. In one way, it's very hard for us to talk about class, and this perhaps has brought more people into the conversation. On the other hand, it perhaps obscures some of the hard economic facts that are at play here. And we can talk more about that later in the case of New York, and particularly Soho and Nolita. So thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Max. Hillary, you're up.
Hi, thanks for having me. And I have Max's book and the tall stack of books that I haven't yet read right next to my computer. I'm looking forward to reading it along with many others. As Juan said, I have COVID. So I don't usually like read my talk, but I'm going to because I was afraid of my COVID brain. But hopefully I'll perk up as we start talking. So my kind of task was to talk about sort of empirical stuff. And I study housing policies, and in particular, I study housing policies and programs that serve people who have low or very low incomes. I'm not an economist, and I don't use quantitative methods in my research. And I've reviewed a lot of the economic literature on supply, which is it's remarkable to me who is quoting that literature, and I wonder who reads it, to be honest. How many of the people who quote it read it? And much of it comes down in favor of sort of the YIMBY arguments. But I want to focus mostly on New York City because that's mainly what I think about and where I've worked for a very long time. But first of all, sort of rather than bearing the lead, I just wanted to start by saying that what motivates me in all of my work, both before I was an academic and now, is the desperate need for truly affordable, high quality housing for all of the people with low incomes who need it. And I'm essentially agnostic as to how we get there. Overall, like my politics are to the left, but I'm also a pragmatist, which is why I value all the experiences that I've had. I've worked in city government and I served on the Rent Guidelines Board, as Juan said. So if the empirical evidence revealed that the best way to get to that goal, affordable, high quality housing for all households with low and very low incomes, was by building a lot of market rate housing everywhere, I would be all in. I'm not in favor of housing as a vehicle for capital accumulation, but I also recognize that we live under capitalism. And I really don't think that, particularly in New York City, where the crisis is so severe, that we can afford to be precious about things like collective ownership and decommodification, or even in some cases, racial and economic integration, although all of those would certainly be my preference. I think, again, people need to be housed. However, I don't think that a market rate building spree will meet this goal for many reasons. First of all, we really need to be focusing on affordability, particularly for the lowest income households. So the question really should not be, will this new housing raise or lower rents, which is what a lot of this research looks at. It should be, will we have enough housing that is affordable to the low income people in this neighborhood? Second, high quality housing means permanent housing. If you have no assurance that your housing expenses will not increase significantly, either when your lease expires and maybe you don't have a lease, or if you fear harassment from your landlord, or if your family and friends and childcare or place of worship are displaced from your community, that's not high quality housing. So there's one study that's frequently cited that finds that new high rises attract new restaurants, which is fine. I like restaurants as much as the next person, but it's really not the kind of amenity that is vital to the day-to-day lives of households with low incomes. So these are some of the reasons why I think it's very critical to complement the economic literature on housing supply with hyper-local qualitative examinations of how additions to the supply of market rate housing affect the lives of real people in real neighborhoods. And as everyone on this call, I think, agrees, all of these issues are particularly important in New York City. That's in part because the city has been in the grip of a severe housing crisis for just about 100 years in kind of whatever way you slice it. It's also because the city controls a lot less land than it used to. Beginning in the Koch administration and continuing until about 15 years ago, New York City's affordable housing programs were powered by what most people call in-rem housing on which the city foreclosed due to real estate tax arrears. But this housing stock, which mostly came into city ownership in the 1970s and 1980s, is mostly depleted. It's mostly kind of left city ownership and turned into affordable housing, which was the goal. And therefore, development of new housing increasingly requires privately owned land. There's other public land that could and should be used, but that's another topic. It might be a good topic for another one of these events. The last three mayoral administrations, de Blasio, Bloomberg, and Giuliani, are frequently criticized for their use of private developers to produce affordable housing. And while I think that's an important point to raise and there should be scrutiny of these developers, it's really not accurate to compare them to the prior administrations in which there was a lot of city-owned land to be developed. In terms of what I would call the supply literature, there is some off-cited research that suggests in certain markets, new construction does not lead to displacement or rent increases. But all of these studies have many caveats about local effects, sizes of events, and the quality of data on rents in particular. It's again, it's a little bit remarkable that we're still relying on Craigslist, for example, in many of these studies to look at rents. And none of them look at the more nuanced effects of displacement pressures. As I discussed, there's a lot that can happen before a household is displaced from a neighborhood that can make it very, very unpleasant to live there. So while it's important to consider this literature, it just seems misguided to cite it as the basis for an entire housing movement. Many people who study housing, including me, argue that the rules of supply and demand don't apply to housing because housing is tied to a specific plot of land, and land is constrained by things like regulations or being on an island in the case of Manhattan. Housing markets are very segmented. Depending on your income and perhaps on your preferences, you will be looking for housing in a particular submarket. This is always the most striking to me when I look at rental housing vacancy rates. Even in a city like New York, where we know there's a very tight rental housing market, the vacancy rates at the high end of the market are usually pretty reasonable. It's when you get to the lower end that they are practically non-existent. So the concept of filtering that Juan talked about in his introduction, the argument that even housing units that start on the high end of the market will eventually make their way into the lower end, doesn't hold true in many markets. And it also ignores the fact that housing isn't like clothing or cars. It takes quite a while to depreciate in value. There really is not great research on how and whether filtering happens. And for the most part, the scholars who make the case that filtering actually occurs really do not propose it as a housing policy to meet housing need. This, again, seems to me like a real perversion of an economic concept that's being used to shape policies. We'll I'm sure talk more about rezoning and zoning, but those who argue against rezoning to create more housing make the argument that upzoning, the ability to build more units on a particular plot of land, increases land value, which leads to higher rents, in other words, to displacement pressures. In New York City, there are data that suggests this, although as always, it's challenging to isolate the effects of rezoning and disentangle them from the effects of gentrification, and the two very often travel together. So that's really sort of a research and policy challenge. The de Blasio administration was criticized by some housing advocates for chasing numbers, for creating lots of housing that on paper was affordable, but wasn't actually affordable to residents of the neighborhoods where it was located, at least not without a lot of extra subsidy. And a subsection of that, and a very important subsection, is the crisis in homelessness. De Blasio inherited a terrible crisis in homelessness from Mayor Bloomberg, who imposed a lot of restrictions on people's abilities to leave homeless shelters. But de Blasio also didn't do much to direct housing production to solving that problem, instead really keeping it distinct from the affordable housing production engine. And I think it remains to be seen what our new mayor does. The one thing that de Blasio did was make the mandatory inclusionary housing program mandatory, as is its name, which was a change from the prior program. And it's still in existence, but it's only triggered when a neighborhood is upzoned. So that administration proposed upzoning 15 neighborhoods that were predominantly low-income communities of color. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this program. I think it's one of those programs on which a lot of ink has already been spilled, but I do want to kind of drop it as a pin in the discussion as something that we may talk about. The rezoning of East New York and Brooklyn, which happened in 2016, was particularly controversial. Many advocates and scholars, including the public advocate at the time, Scott Stringer, noted that it would provide no affordable housing for current residents who were extremely low income, and would likely lead to displacement and gentrification. And now it appears that a lot of the strategies intended to prevent these displacement effects have fallen by the wayside. As many have pointed out, this approach, the rezoning, mandatory inclusionary housing type program, takes neighborhoods that have not yet gentrified and incentivizes gentrification by increasing land value, because an upzone plot of land can host more housing units. So the concern with inclusionary housing and the link to the YIMBY-NIMBY debate is that it's saying that the market, not the state, should be meeting housing needs. And we all know that is simply not going to work. That's why we have a permanent housing crisis in New York City. As many have noted, the amount of subsidy needed to ensure that housing in New York City is affordable for all demands significant federal support, probably $3 to $7 billion annually. So the YIMBY approach and the approach of harnessing the market just isn't going, my position is, it's not going to meet the needs of the people who really need the affordable housing development. And maybe that kind of goes to what Max focused on. The people, the YIMBY leaders don't really care about those people. So that's what I have to say so far.
Thank you, Hillary. Bob, you're up.
Yeah, so thanks, Juan, and thanks to Village Preservation. Am I on?
You are.
Okay. Thanks to Village Preservation for organizing this event. I think it's an important set of issues. The advertised title, if I read this correctly, for this discussion was something like YIMBY versus NIMBY, looking past labels. And I want to use my time here to advocate for doing exactly that. I want to propose that we might have a much more useful conversation if we could stop talking about YIMBYs and NIMBYs entirely. I think the labels are unhelpful. They oversimplify complex and complicated issues, and each term includes divergent, even contradictory positions that we mistakenly cram under a single label, and reducing the discussion to a conflict between YIMBYs and NIMBYs replaces serious policy discussion with politics by bumper sticker. So to get beyond the labels, I want to try to dispel two myths about YIMBYism and then highlight three issues for discussion. So 2 myths, 3 issues, and then we can open it up for questions and discussion. So myth number 1, YIMBYism is a new or recent development. There's a currently fashionable narrative out there that describes YIMBYism as a brand new social movement that burst on the scene a few years ago as a new and exciting idea that was invented by millennials and is propelled by social media that didn't even exist a few years ago. But if YIMBYism at its core is about eliminating government regulations that get in the way of the market, well, that idea obviously has been around for a very long time. If we were able, through some historical research, to locate the very first government regulation, maybe back in the days of laissez-faire or rampant monopolies or child labor or urban slums, it's probably the case that that government regulation meant to address one of those issues was probably met by complaints that it would interfere with the market and impede economic growth. So the ideology of deregulation goes under a lot of names: liberalism, neoliberalism, free markets, market fundamentalism. And obviously that ideology has been around for a very long time, maybe summed up by Ronald Reagan in his famous quote, his famous comment at a news conference back in 1986, where he said, quote, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help." So YIMBYism isn't new, it's just a new name for a very old idea. And I think we should not dress it up with a veneer of novelty or creativity or innovation or excitement over a new hot idea, because we've seen this movie before. And it's a continuation of a very long running debate about the respective roles of states and markets and the relation between them, and the same issues that have driven that debate into the ground for decades, maybe even centuries, without resolution, continue to apply in this latest variation on a very old theme. So that's myth number one. Myth number two follows from the first, and that is the belief that regulation is bad and deregulation is good. This claim comes in two forms, from the right and from the left. From the right, deregulation means free markets, economic growth, and higher profits. From the left, deregulation means eliminating exclusionary barriers that prevent equal access to social goods. And obviously, these are absolutely not the same thing. They both use the language of deregulation, but they're driven by fundamentally different goals that produce fundamentally different deregulatory policies and lead to fundamentally different outcomes. And even though they both claim to be about the same thing, deregulation, the deregulation that's good for the right is not good for the left, and vice versa. And it's a mistake to combine these under a single label. A variant on this myth is that YIMBYism is progressive while NIMBYism is negative and reactionary. To characterize all NIMBYs as exclusionary and reactionary ignores the context. When an affluent suburban community opposes higher density development or multifamily housing, it's probably fair to characterize that opposition as reactionary. When poor communities say no to unwanted development, they're not being reactionary, they're demanding social and environmental justice. So another reason to dump the YIMBY and NIMBY labels is that although YIMBYism sounds like a simple slogan, eliminate government regulation, that everyone can get behind, urban social problems, like the ones that Hillary just described, housing affordability, class and race segregation, gentrification and displacement, political disempowerment, and all the rest are just not that simple. They're complicated and thorny, and that's why they've been around for as long as they have, and they won't be solved with simple slogans that gloss over the hard, long politics of social change. So those are the two myths. Let me make three quick observations, and then we can open this up for questions and discussion. Point number one, I have 3 points. Point number one, YIMBYist deregulation is a blunt instrument in a situation that requires a scalpel. Not all regulations are bad, and poor communities in particular need government regulations to protect them from displacement, exploitation, and injustice. Not all NIMBYs are exclusionary, and poor communities should not be deprived of regulatory protections. Not all YIMBYs want the same thing, and to equate breaking down discriminatory barriers on the one hand with the triumph of the market on the other hand gives a gloss of legitimacy to markets that markets don't deserve. Point number two, you can't rely on the market to solve problems that are of no concern to the market. Markets exist for one purpose and one purpose only, to make profits. Markets don't work the same way for everyone, don't benefit everyone equally, and to rely on the market to solve social problems is simply using the wrong tool for the job. It's like picking up a hammer to drive in a screw, and when you pick up a hammer, as the saying goes, every problem looks like a nail. To expect markets to solve social problems, you're saying you're satisfied to get just so much social benefit as is compatible with the profitability of the market. You're agreeing to settle for the crumbs that are left over after the market has eaten you for lunch. Relying on market solutions isn't being realistic or hard-nosed or non-idealistic, or whatever you want to call it. It's just simply capitulation. So point number 3, and then I'll be finished. For progressives to jump on the YIMBY bandwagon is a risky and dangerous proposition. If it succeeds in its objective of deregulation, what we'll most probably see is a rollback of protective regulations that restrain the market without eliminating exclusionary regulations that maximize profits at the expense of social goals. There is indeed a certain irony, in my view, in mobilizing a social movement on behalf of the market. The market doesn't need a social movement. It's doing just fine. Thank you very much. If you want to mobilize a social movement, then maybe aim a little bit higher rather than capitulating to the market and giving it a veneer of legitimacy.
Thank you very much, Bob. Please put in questions in the Q&A. While folks do that, I'll get us started with 3 questions. I'll hit them in order for each of you. Max, I wanted to ask you about neighborhood character, because that's something that organizationally we care about. Your book left me with the impression that one of the obstacles standing in the way of compromise over urban design changes to a neighborhood is YIMBY's failure to, 1, recognize that a desire to defend neighborhood character might stem from reasonable preferences that can be debated, and 2, YIMBY's failure to advance positively stated urban design principles. I mean by that, not just a repudiation of suburban typologies, but positively stated principles of their own. You describe YIMBYs on the one hand in your book as having on their bedside table a copy of Jane Jacobs' Death and Life, and on the other, looking approvingly towards urbanism in Asia, which you dub verticalism. And then on top of that, YIMBYs are active in New York, even though you find here ample expressions of both models. So how does one grapple with these somewhat contradictory impulses? Is there a principle there, or is ideal urban form for YIMBYs just a function of whatever they believe is most likely to give access to neighborhoods that they cannot afford? I'll do them all, and I'll let you answer, and hopefully by then we'll have more questions. Hillary, over the past several decades, the local residential construction market has gone through several boom and bust cycles. Over the past 30 years alone, for instance, the number of permits issued per year for new residential units has ranged from 5,000 to 55,000. Do we know whether these huge variations have corresponded in some way with fluctuations in the severity of the affordability crisis or in the percentage of the rent-burdened population? And lastly, Bob, you wrote in 1993, you might recall, that criticizing NIMBY opposition to, say, development that might theoretically increase affordability is appealing because it's far easier than addressing the structural causes for poverty and consequently for the affordable housing crisis. As a long-term solution, you then propose mobilizing a constituency in support of a national solution to this underlying problem. But as a pragmatic short-term solution, that's what I wanted to ask you about, you propose a compromise between community and real estate, which you characterize as provisional and contingent on the politics of the moment. What is your sense of the politics of the moment when even self-proclaimed progressive elected officials view market supply-based solutions such as mandatory inclusionary housing as a primary strategy for addressing the affordable housing crisis, despite the possibility of displacing vulnerable populations, and especially when these are interspersed among wealthy households, as they often are in New York? So you can take them in order.
Great. Okay, that gives us a lot to work with. Look, I want to say that YIMBYism is a huge tent movement. That's the way they like it. And I think that lets in a lot of people. On one hand, there's people who are socialists who want to expand public housing, and their single sort of deregulatory goal is to get rid of single family zoning. So in that sense, actually, what Bob said about kind of market fundamentalism and the sort of Milton Friedmanization of housing policy, I want to push back a little bit, because I think that there are people who are on that side. There are some libertarians who see the kind of the erasure of single family zoning as the first step in getting rid of all zoning. I want to say that's sort of a minority, and I don't know how many actual market fundamentalists there are in the movement. And I would say that some of them are overrepresented because they are very loud on social media. That said, it's a very kind of realpolitik movement that wants to, find solutions for each neighborhood. I think that the kind of, when it comes to design, they're probably much more in favor of a European Jane Jacobs townhouse, small apartment building ideal to fill in the kind of neighborhoods that are kind of the inner suburbia, the kind of streetcar suburbs that we see in a lot of cities that developed in the 19-teens and 20s. That said, I think that they also think that there are different carrying capacities for different neighborhoods, and that if someone wants to build a big tower in a central business district, then they can potentially get zoning permission for that if they have if they've kind of gone through the zoning commission. I think that the issue is when their kind of ideals get in the way of how they're acting on the ground. And that becomes an issue because it's a dispersed movement. All the groups are different, and the participants in each group are also have different political ideologies, and some of them actually quite run the spectrum. I think that gets a little messy, though, on these kind of ad hoc issues where you have a huge outcry to build in wealthy neighborhoods and to make wealthy neighborhoods carry the burden of more affordable housing, whether that's public-private partnerships, more public housing, or market rate housing. And then you have the major San Francisco YIMBY groups advocating for development in the Mission, in Oakland, and in poor neighborhoods. So I think that is one of the major kind of things that's come out in the past 10 years with the sort of growth of these groups and their large amount of media attention is, will they keep to their ideals of building in already wealthy neighborhoods that are already well provided for when it comes to public services? So I think that, yeah, in general, there probably is an ideal of sort of middle density townhouses and small apartment blocks, but it's variable.
I wanted to link that answer, especially with regard to your observation about their focus on wealthy neighborhoods, by calling attention to the question of metrics by which we determine that. Soho NoHo, this is an argument that came up there, is a wealthy neighborhood where 27% of the population has an income of less than $50,000 a year and could not afford the affordable housing that was being proposed under the rezoning. So that goes to the question that I asked Bob about the reliance by otherwise even within a progressive camp for this kind of market-based solution, because the optics of them are favorable, not because looking at them in closer scrutiny would substantiate their goals. Hillary.
So the question to me was, what has been the impact of all of this sort of tidal wave of development over the past, who knows how long? And the answer is, no, it hasn't. We've been in a housing crisis. We continue to be in a severe housing crisis. There continues to be very low rental vacancy rates. There continue to be very high prices. I mean, interestingly, we saw a little bit of that pressure valve releasing during the peak years of the pandemic, when we had both eviction protections in place. The rent guidelines board, after I left it, but I'm sorry I wasn't on it then, froze rent increases for either 1 or 2 years, and people were getting, pandemic cash relief. So that, and there actually was not very much construction going on, right? Because we were in a pandemic. So that's kind of interesting to note. I think this is also an example of how New York, housing doesn't work with the typical supply and demand curve. And New York in particular, there is endless demand for housing here. And, increasingly, a lot of it is external. A lot of it is from foreign investors or people who are, buying a pied-à-terre. So their demand is never going to let up. We're never going to be able to build enough. So I think, yeah, that's a good example of how sort of flooding the market, there's not a release valve there.
Okay, thank you, Hillary. My question about that thing you wrote back in '93.
I'm going to have to reread that piece because it's not fresh in my mind. But I think the point about, I want to reiterate my point about how we're getting hung up on labels rather than on substance. And I think the discussion about what YIMBYism includes and doesn't include is exactly to my point. People in one YIMBY organization or one YIMBY initiative will say YIMBYism means what I do. And somebody in a different kind of YIMBY organization oriented in a different direction will say, no, it's not, it's what I do. And these two groups can't talk to each other because they're fundamentally different. I talked about it in simplified terms in terms of progressives and libertarians and so on. But I think that this kind of confusion is exactly to my point about how we need to get away from the labels and start talking about the issues. And it's not a quantitative, Max, I think I would disagree a little bit with you. It's not a quantitative question about how many of one kind of YIMBYs there are versus another. And it may be even not, it may even not be a question of which faction or which kind of YIMBYism or which political flavor of YIMBYism is louder or more effective or more visible or more present. When we use the singular label to conflate such fundamentally different worldviews, policy objectives, policy methods, aims, and experiences, we just get tangled up in words, and we're distracted from what is fundamentally at issue, which is arguably the question of affordable housing or all of the other issues that we academics, policy people, people on the street, voters, have been debating in cities and where people live for generations. And I think we've been sidetracked by the debates about what the label means and what it includes, sidetracked from the issues where we're having a semantic debate rather than a substantive debate.
That was sort of a response to Max and not an answer to my question, though. Should I reformulate it?
Well, you can give me another shot, sure.
So the question was about your observation back in '93, which maybe you don't think it pertains anymore, that the opposition to NIMBY is popular because it is easier to do than addressing the fundamental problems that animate this conflict to begin with. And then you offer the long-term solution, which involves mobilization at a national level. And then you offer the short-term pragmatic solution. The short-term pragmatic solution is the one that I wanted to ask you about. That's an observation that I made in the introduction, that a lot of the impetus behind these movements have been a feeling we're constrained by the politically possible. And so since we cannot build public housing, then the only game in town is public-private partnerships, or whatever the case may be. So your short-term solution, as you proposed it back then, was a compromise between community and real estate, and you characterized that as contingent on the politics of the moment. And I wanted to ask you about your sense of the politics of the moment. And to color that that response, I made reference to the fact that even progressive elected officials favor market supply-based solutions, such as mandatory inclusionary zoning, despite the possibility of displacement of vulnerable populations, and especially when the optics of them are good, because these populations are interspersed among wealthier communities. So, in a word, your sense of the politics of the moment, given what we've seen over the past few years from a progressive caucus and a progressive mayor. Is there any short-term goal, hope, Bob?
Is there a short-term hope?
Hope of compromise. What are the contours of this compromise that you set forward as your short-term solution?
I think part of the dilemma is that when we, I don't know if it's acknowledge or admit that, in your words, we can't build public housing. The question for me is the reason we can't build public housing because the politics of the moment doesn't support it, the real estate industry doesn't want the competition, the market doesn't want to have the public building housing when there's profit to be made by private developers and building housing. Is it that opposition, or is the reason we can't build public housing because progressive people say we can't build public housing, and so we might as well just get on with it and don't even think about that as an agenda item because it's not realistic, right? We are committing a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't know that I completely understand or agree with the easy distinction between short-term and long-term.
It's your distinction. It's your distinction. But that's fine. That's fine.
Well, if that's the case, and I'll have to go back and reread my 1993. I was a different person then than I am now, and my thinking has changed, because what I will say now is that the long term is consists of the short term, and the short term creates the long term, and it's a fallacy to say we have to be pragmatic in the vulgar sense, realistic, recognize political constraints, and get on with what we can get on with, because that has the effect of replicating and duplicating and reinforcing all of the problems and reasons that we have said that we can't act politically in the short term. And then who do we blame, right? It's a perpetual situation that the moment is never auspicious for what we want to achieve. If we wait for that auspicious moment, we'll all, to use your term, we'll all be dead, right? And so, yeah, these are fundamentally complex and difficult issues and problems that require a difficult and contentious politics. And I fully understand and I fully recognize that that's easy for me as not only an academic, but an emeritus academic to make that statement. And yet I think we can't duck that responsibility.
Okay, great, thank you. So let's open it up for questions, please. We have plenty of time. So I'm gonna ask Leanne to promote some of you to panelists so you can pose the question yourself. We can start with Alex Reichel. It will take a moment for her to assuming that you want to be promoted, keep your camera off if you're not wearing a shirt or something. So Alex Reichel and then Todd Fine. Alex, are you there? Alex? Well, maybe he come in. Let's start with Todd 10 and then move back to Alex. Todd, are you there? Alex? Okay. So then I'll relay them personally. Let's start with an anonymous attendee who asks about addressing whether you can address historical preservation in the context of your discussion. That's kind of broad. I think that the question of neighborhood character touches a little bit on that, but only from a design perspective. There are other dimensions, obviously, to neighborhood preservation than just that. But any reactions to that?
I guess I would just say that within this conversation about densification and affordability, there's been a sort of push to get historic preservation down from the neighborhood level and towards the level of individual structures, and that community character is very much distrusted because it's something that's often used in wealthy neighborhoods as a way to sort of say, like, we have a special neighborhood that has so much amazing grace and history that you can't touch any of it, even if that's like a strip mall on the side of it, or some building that's like a 1960s brick ranch house. So there is a bit of hesitancy to embrace that at the level of an entire community. And I will say some of that is warranted. But that's proved really problematic because it's alienated people who have fought for historic preservation and who have seen a lot of historic preservation defeats in their lifetime. And that's created some very, some lasting animosity within different city dynamics.
Yeah, I was going to say something somewhat similar, which is that, I mean, it sort of goes to what Bob was saying about NIMBYism. I mean, historic preservation gets a bad name, but it really depends on the context. And there are plenty of reasons you could imagine why a low-income community or a community of color, there might be some very good reasons why they want to preserve their neighborhood. It's not all, you know, I live in Brooklyn, so I can make fun of it. People in Brooklyn, like, you know, saying what type of street lamp you need to have or what your shutters need to look like. So I think it's an example of how you have to think about the context, and you have to think about what people are seeking.
And I would just add to that if we mean by historic preservation a design question, right? What kind of architectural design do we want to preserve? That seems to be entirely separate from, and I think Hillary, you mentioned this in your introductory remarks, the income and class question, right? There is no reason in the world that we can't preserve historical architecture and make that housing affordable. It's no more expensive to build schlocky looking, poorly designed housing than to preserve historically valuable design housing. And so, yeah, of course, it seems to me they're completely compatible. There are all sorts of housing developments being built right now in very low income neighborhoods that incorporate extraordinary design and at no greater cost. And so we have a lot of smart architects out there that know how to deliver good quality multifamily housing that can be affordable. There's no correlation, seems to me, between good design and high income.
Thank you. So I don't know if I'm going to try to get Alex promoted as panelist, since He seems to have stepped away. In the interest of time, I'm just going to read his comment and have you guys respond. So thanks to the panel for all the insightful comments. Max's description of the YIMBY demographics sound a lot like the folks I read about who are resisting a return to traditional workplaces and often relocating out to small towns and rural areas like Hudson Valley for more space at lower cost and sending back rake reviews of the bucolic life. So I'm wondering, how deeply committed are they to high density, big city, urban lifestyles of New York or San Francisco, especially in the wake of the pandemic? After all, if new urbanism is the framework, it was never actually very urban. Thank you. To that, I might add that Manhattan has lost more, which is especially rich in work, remote possibilities, has lost more population than any county of 10,000 people or more in the entire country.
That's a great question. I wish I had the answer to that question. I definitely agree that some of the people who are in this movement, some of the thousands of people who go to meetings, have the ability to work remotely because they have white collar jobs, some of them in tech, some of them in consulting, academia, etc. I have no data about whether or not they have relocated. I personally live in Australia, in Melbourne, where there's a lot of people who have moved to nearby regional cities of about between 50, 100,000 people. And they've seen huge price gains there. Yeah, it's true. Some of these places had really struggling economic development plans for decades. And now they've suddenly gotten an influx of new residents. And it's created some tensions as well, because it's usually people with more money. And also some of the places that people have relocated to, particularly the Hudson Valley, which is mentioned in the comment, are places that are actually really walkable and have pretty dense housing. And I think that, it's not such a bad thing that people are going to some of these towns and taking out, housing, which is on a kind of walkable basis. So I think that people are drawn to places that are not the kind of sprawling suburbia of the 1960s, but more of the kind of streetcar rail suburbia of the 1920s. And I think that's a good thing. I think there's a lot of really great urban planning solutions that can build more in those areas and help rejuvenate some of the local economies, which in the Hudson Valley is really patchy. Some are incredibly wealthy and some are not. So if people want to move to Newburgh, New York, I think that's not such a bad thing.
Any other response, or should I? No, we're good. This is more of a comment from Uta. Actually, Leanne, can you promote Uta, see if she wants to make her observation herself? Let me try one more time. Let's give her a second.
Uta, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. Great panel. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. Yes, so, about coming from the Canadian perspective, and, that quite often is ignored because everything focuses on New York. We have seen a lot over San Francisco. We have seen a lot of development in Toronto over the last 20 years, which we call the condominium boom. And since the mid-2000s, so 17 years ago, we actually have in Toronto a so-called YIMBY festival. So I was just doing a contribution to the history of YIMBY, and I'm fully with Bob. We should actually not use those labels. We actually should talk about the substance and what it stands for. And as the discussion also shows, there's a great variety within the YIMBY, particularly also what is in the chat now, how people understand themselves. So yeah, labels don't work. We have to be more provocative, more analytical, and progressive with asking for policies that actually do create affordable housing. In Toronto, we right now have a huge debate in Ontario in general about deregulation, the entire zoning, getting rid of the entire zoning. One of the candidates, the mayoral candidates, is arguing for that. And he is actually coming from the progressive left. So I think the entire debate that we have, that you guys are having here, I think is very fruitful, very important for making the point of, if we actually talk about affordable housing, truly affordable housing, from my perspective, only policies and straightforward creation of social housing, affordable housing, is creating this this environment where people actually can afford their home, and the market is not going to do that. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak here. It's not really a question, it's just adding to the debate on YIMBYs and NIMBYs. Thank you.
Thank you. To bring it back to New York, no, but I do have a question relating to her observation, because the history of the movement, which you trace back, Max, to San Francisco 10 years ago, is something that has that raised some questions for me, because I believe I forwarded to you the YIMBY New York website, which claims to have been founded by, or this fellow claims to have founded, I think a little bit over 10 years ago himself. This website does not focus on housing exclusively. It celebrates any kind of development. And I'm wondering if there's any affiliation at all, what this is, what to make of it. Then there's Open New York, which is its own thing. Was very active in the Soho NoHo rezoning. What does the YIMBY landscape look like in New York, if you have looked at it closely enough to be able to characterize it?
So, I mean, YIMBYism is not actually, as Bob has said, it's not a new idea. It takes ideas that have to do with deregulation, but also new urbanist ideas, and creates some kind of strange bedfellows. There are places like Houston, Texas that have no zoning, which some YIMBYs might really like. And people have been talking about it for a long time. But 10 years ago, it became a household word. It became part of political platforms. It became something that really got people going. I think that it's something that doesn't have as much sway in New York, as far as I understand it. And maybe it's a little different here, because in New York, I think it's been a pro-development city for a long time, particularly in the rezoning of the Bloomberg years. That's not something you need to really convince people of. Neither is living in a dense place and having neighbors in an apartment building and taking the subway. Those things are all pretty natural. I think that, in other cities it looks really different. You have places where you want to build an apartment unit, you need 2 cars per apartment. There's minimum parking requirements. That's something that New Yorkers, I think, are pretty comfortable with. And I think it also responds to a different layout of cities. Places like Minneapolis, that were previously, before a massive overhaul of their zoning laws, was zoned like between 60 and 70% single family housing. To have some sort of like soft densification with accessory dwelling units, which is a big YIMBY talking point, and not super effective in terms of increasing the housing stock. But yeah, so I think here in New York, it means something a little bit different. I will say that, one of the big questions is that, we already, I think, have said that, the kind of market-based approach is not going to work. The private sector is not going to solve this problem. However, the public sector also seems incapable of solving this problem. And so I think one thing that a lot of kind of centrist people who are involved in this movement is they want some answers from both. They want public-private partnerships. They want some zoning red tape eliminated when it comes to big projects, because the kind of left version of all public housing, that does not seem like it's going to happen federally or in progressive cities.
That's precisely what seems so. You say that it has not gained a foothold, but it clearly has. If nothing else, it has provided cover the cover of social justice for folks who are promoting rezoning in places where they make sense from a certain perspective, but you are putting at risk a certain population. You are putting the goal of affordable housing over any other concerns, over neighborhood planning for the most part. It's essentially the same kind of impetus that drives large-scale rezonings throughout the city. It's just that it has this sheen of social justice attached to it. So it's that's not nothing, right? It's certainly enough. Either I don't want to attribute the responsibility to them for this, but the alignment of progressive in what before would not have been a progressive friendly solution is a notable shift towards these marketplace based solutions, towards these large scale rezonings, these what Jane Jacobs herself would call cataclysmic investing pouring into a neighborhood, which is something that I don't want to necessarily move the conversation in that direction. Fair enough. So your point then is that the YIMBY iteration here is different from what you have been describing, and that website that celebrates all kind of development should not be regarded as part of the movement or whatever we want to call it. That's why I started out with the question of how to best understand this, whether this was actually a movement or whether it's just a label affixed to very different kinds of pro-growth factions.
Let me just say, I think that, sorry to interrupt, but I think that in New York, there's also a very special relationship with YIMBYism, which is that during the Bloomberg era in the early 2000s, they saw a tremendous amount of upzoning, but they didn't see a lot of affordability included in those projects. And I think that some people who are very progressive and genuinely want to find a solution to the housing problem, and who have some real data on their side about building new housing that slowly decreases prices, they said we walked away from a lot of projects instead of demanding affordability within those projects. And I think that now the idea is let's not immediately say no to private market rate development, but let's demand as much affordability as possible. And in that sense, I think it's a realistic sort of detour from the kind of build all public housing progressive stance that we heard for a long time, which I think is unrealistic at this moment.
That is fair enough, but mandatory inclusionary housing, the percentage is set. You cannot ask for more you could ask for more affordability if you're putting more subsidy in it. And Hillary, you can speak to that better than I can. But the percentage is set, and the median income to which it is targeted is set. So you're not getting more than that. MIH, incidentally, mandatory inclusionary zoning, was opposed by, again, Hillary, you probably have the numbers. How many community boards opposed this? And it was still pushed through for a number of reasons, but primarily because it thought that it was not doing enough. Hillary, I'm here trying to, off the top of my head, trying to improvise this. You probably know this better than I do. Or you?
I don't. I mean,
I
I actually don't remember the details of that, but it's something like that. I mean, what I was going to say is I think Max is really right that the Bloomberg administration really, and we don't need to go like an old timey go through all the administrations, but they sort of created the conditions for this to happen by doing all these rezonings and not, in most cases, not capitulating at all to demands for include. I mean, there were a few like really lightweight inclusionary things, like in the Greenpoint, Williamsburg rezoning, but then they just backed away from all of those. I mean, if you go back and look, nothing really happened. So I think Max is totally right that people felt so out of that, left out of that process that and I, frankly, I think de Blasio did this in many places. He came in, he was willing to talk, people kind of came to the table. And yeah, I mean, and they felt like there wasn't going to be, and actually, again, I mean, we're not talking about public housing here, but I will just say, I think, what de Blasio, the way that de Blasio, worse than ignored the situation at NYCHA, really allowed things to get to a level of complete catastrophe. They didn't care about public housing, that administration. So I think people felt like there was going to be no traction there. Do I think that, that was the right approach? No, but you can see why that happened. And again, to sort of build on what Bob was saying, like, I don't understand. I sometimes say, like, I never got this memo that we gave up on the state. Like, I think I never got the memo that we gave up on the state, and I never got the memo that regulation is bad. I feel like everyone started saying that, and I was like, what? I think, I still think there's a lot that could happen with public housing. I think there would have to be a really, really strong movement, but that could happen. And I think, it just sort of this sort of slogan that all regulation is bad makes absolutely no sense to me, particularly those of us who live in New York City, where everything we do is regulated. I mean, it just seems bizarre. So that's all I would say about that.
So I would just jump in here real quickly, because I think part of what's going on is that with this situation is that we've really seen a reversal of ends and means, right? If the end that we're aiming for is, let's say, affordable housing, well, then the question is, okay, what is the means through which to deliver that? Is it private? Is it public? Is it subsidies? Is it federal allocation? Is it a reallocation of budgets? I mean, how do we get to that end of affordable housing that, let's for a moment assume there is political support that says that's a worthwhile end, right? We don't do that anymore. And I think the mandatory inclusionary is a good example of that. Now, the affordable units are the means through which the market can build profitable housing. And we're prioritizing that we've reversed the means and the ends. We no longer define our goals, our means, our policy objectives in terms of some political consensus of what our need priorities are. The priority is the market, and everything has to fit as a means to that end. And that's why we are where we are and why we're having this conversation.
Max, someone is asking a question about ageism within the YIMBY movement. This goes a little bit to, not a little bit, it goes entirely to the observation that you made about this being cast as a generational movement, as a generational divide instead of as a class one. This is something that certainly played out in Soho NoHo, where not entirely, it was not entirely the case, but it was the case that a portion of the lower income population there were people there, artists, people who have been in Soho since the 1970s, who had sort of built a neighborhood through sweat equity, and who are low income and could not afford even the so-called affordable housing that was being built over MIH. There are also recent immigrants in one corner of the rezoning district. But to stay on the question of generations, could you speak a little bit about, or elaborate on the point that you started to make about the advantages and disadvantages of having this turn on age or generations, and likewise for class, the cost of leaving class out of the question?
Yeah, I think that it's sort of common within these circles to talk about people having precarious housing situations, to be rent burdened, to be unable to afford a mortgage, as people who are under 40, and people who are, in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, or the people who have these amazing houses and they've paid off their mortgage and their house has just gone up in value year after year. And now they're sitting on a place that's worth $2 million and they don't want anyone else to come in. And I think that's a real oversimplification that gets away from some class dynamics that are really important and really hard to talk about in the United States and other places. Also, as you're alluding to, there's a reason why in the big fight in Nolita, Haven Green is like for seniors, which is because that's a big problem in some communities, is people who are unhoused and who are older, who are over 65. There's also people who do have houses, but who can barely hang on to them. I was teaching a course in Melbourne before the pandemic. The largest new demographic of homelessness there is women over 65 years old, because their pensions are very bad compared to their male counterparts. And that is the fastest growing group of people who are experiencing homelessness. So I think that thinking about this in terms of age, it has its merits, but I think it also goes to a larger conflict in American politics about, how is every big politician in their 70s? And I think there's a kind of angst there that is not super helpful for solving the housing crisis, but it sells well. And it's very visceral to people. And I think that's why it's become such a mover of this movement and why it's become so widespread.
To translate that to the New York context, where 70% of the population, I think 68, rents, it is not about a generation that is homeowners, it's about a generation that is in rent stabilized housing. And there, the risk is you don't have a situation where these people are going to cash out. The possibility is it's the possibility of tenant harassment, which has been rampant in a lot of these neighborhoods, and the possibility ultimately of displacement, since demolition is one of the few avenues available for bringing units out of rent stabilization, which is a depressing way to end what otherwise was a very enjoyable and informative panel. I hope it was for me. I hope it was for everyone. We will keep track of all the comments. I'm going to write about this subsequently. We may do something like this in the future. If you want to send comments about future topics that you'd like to see addressed, especially if they're related to this, but not necessarily, please contact us. And thank you very much, and good evening or good night.